guys, I'm Hannah, and today it's time for the next lesson in how to hand build.
Hey, just like with the how to make a pinch pot video, I've decided to release a short and a long version of this video. This is the short version, but unlike last time, I've had to break it down into 3 parts. Turns out 3 days on a project is just too much to cover in one shorter video, even with time lapses and cuts. This way you can take it in shorter chunks or binge it all before you go work on your own pottery. The longer version is a make-along. Everything is real time so that you can work at pace with the video, hopefully getting to each new set of instructions just as you're ready for them. If you want to watch the make-along version, you can click the link that should be right here, or find a link down in the video description. Okay, back to the studio.
I've got a new camera set up, so I've got a camera arm here, so I don't have to wear the hat or the camera on my head, which is really nice, and hopefully you get some good top-down views as well as front angle. Today I'm going to show you how to make coil pots. Last time I showed you how to make pinch pots, and hopefully you made a closed form and a bowl. If you're really not interested in making pinch pots, you don't have to do that first, but we are going to use some skills that we really built up by making pinch pots. Specifically, the ability to feel how thick your clay is and learning how to pinch and move that clay around to blend it and smooth it. But we'll go over those skills today too. It's just that those of you who made a pinch pot may find this process a little bit easier. Even if you don't make pinch pots before you make coil pots, I do recommend that you learn how to make pinch pots because it really hones those basic skills, which will benefit you regardless of what type of hand building method you're using, and even if you're wheel throwing. But let's jump into today. We are making coil pots. Now, we only need a few basic tools. We need a bowl or bucket of water. It doesn't have to be a lot. You'll want a little sponge and a needle tool. And those are the most basic things that you'll need. Now, I do have some other tools I'm going to be using, but you don't have to have them in order to make a coil pot. I'll show you how to use them, but I'll also try to show you how to use just the bare minimum to do the same steps. So those other tools, if you have them that are nice, are a serrated rib, a plastic or rubber rib, some basic wooden tools, a rolling pin to make the foot, and I also have these wooden rulers that I just got from the hardware store that make nice spacers for rolling out a slab. And lastly, you might want to use slip. We're going to be joining coils to each other, so you might want some slip to act like a glue. You can just use water, which is usually what I do, but I will show you how to make some slip if you want to use it. So let's start there. So you just want a container with a lid. You can buy some Tupperware for this, but I recommend just washing something like an old butter container, or this was Parmesan cheese. That's a good way to save some money. If you do buy a container, I recommend staying away from containers that have like a threaded lid that you twist on and off. Those threads can get clogged up with clay, and that can make clay dust and make the lid hard to put on or take off. Slip can be easily made from dried out scraps of clay as you're working, but if you're starting a fresh project, you don't have any clay scraps right now, we're going to start with the clay that we're making the pot out of. So if you're making slip specifically for this project, you want to use slip made from the clay that you'll be working with. I have used slips before that didn't match the clay body I was working with, and that can be kind of distracting when you're building and the slip color dries a different color than the clay body you're using. And it can show depending on what kind of glaze you use on the final piece. And you want to make sure, like, this is a high fire clay, so I want to make sure I'm using a high fire slip. I wouldn't want to accidentally mix and match low fire and mid fire, or low fire and high fire clays, because that would cause a big problem during firing. So to make slip, we're going to start by rolling a coil. So we'll get a little introduction here. Now, I have this wad of clay that was just kind of sitting on top, and I'm just squeezing it out in sort of a long, thicker coil. A coil is just basically a long cylinder. So I'm just squeezing it out to get it started, and then I'll put it on my table and start to roll it. And hopefully my head isn't in the shot, but if it is, work on that. Okay, and because this clay is already getting pretty wide, I'm gonna go ahead and tear that in half. It doesn't matter how wide or how long your coil gets here. What matters is we want it to be pretty thin. And if your coil's starting to go flat, we'll talk about this more, but you just want to do what I call a candy twist. You're just going to twist the clay a little bit. That's just going to help get over that flatness and get it back into round. Okay, this doesn't have to be a pretty coil or anything. All we're doing is setting it up to make some slip. Then we're just gonna twist that into a little loop, like a little fish. When this is completely bone dry, we'll put it into our container with some water, but it needs to dry out first. So I'm just gonna set it aside. Now, if you need to wait on that because you really wanna use slip, you can. You may be waiting until tomorrow. Next day, Hannah here to show you how to finish making your slip. So my coil is completely dry now. So I'm just gonna break it into pieces small enough to fit into my container. I want them to be able to lay down on the bottom. That way I can put some water in there. And I don't want to put too much. I'm not even going to put enough to completely submerge the pieces because that might be too much. The amount of water that you put in is going to determine how thick your slip is. So if you don't put in enough, the clay won't slake, it won't break down in the water completely. But if you put too much, you're not really gonna have slip, you're just gonna have dirty water. So you wanna put in a good amount, and then I'm gonna put the lid on this. Whether there's a lid or not, doesn't really matter. And just set it aside and let that clay slake. And then once the clay has completely broken down, I'll stir it up to get it to a good consistency. But I'm just gonna set it aside for now and get back to work on the coil pot. Another future Hannah here. Let's check on this. I've been working on my pot and now I'm gonna check and see how this is doing. See how the clay has broken down a lot? If I shake it up, it gets kind of mixed in and that clay no longer holds a shape. So we can go ahead and stir that up, and I'm just gonna use this end of this wooden tool here. Sometimes I like to use a paintbrush because it breaks down the clay even more. But I don't always like abusing my paintbrushes that way. But I think I am gonna switch to a paintbrush here. And what that paintbrush does is it kind of acts like a whisk. It'll break down those particles more. And I don't have to get all the clay broken down into the water. I can keep stirring it later when I'm working with it. Just get that extra slip out of there. That's a pretty good thickness. Right, so it builds up a coat on my fingers. So that's a pretty good thickness. You may like to have your slip thicker. Some people like to have their slip like almost able to be like sculpted with, pretty thick, almost clay. Some people like it more watery. I like it somewhere in between for building with. I like it a little bit thicker if I'm gonna be doing slip decoration. That's pretty well done. Let me wash my hands, I'll be right back. Since my container has a lid, I can put the lid on and see how shaking it up does. So let's try that. Just want to be careful, I don't want the lid to shake off. And depending on your container, if your lid isn't watertight, you may find this messier and splashing. Oh yeah, that's nice. That smoothed and mixed it up a lot. Okay, I'll just use my brush to kind of wipe down the sides. If I don't wipe down the sides, even if this container is sealed, the water from the slip on the sides will like evaporate out or condense down into the bottom. And I don't want to have a bunch of just dry clay on the sides of my container. It wouldn't hurt anything, I just wouldn't be able to use it as slip immediately. So any of that clay that dries on the side can be broken and dumped back into the bottom and reincorporated into the slip. See, that's nice and thick. It kind of holds its shape when you stir it. and it holds its shape on the brush. And I'm just cleaning my lid and the lip of my container here so that the clay there doesn't dry and make it difficult to open. Okay, so that's ready for me to use next time. Now to start our coil pot, we need to have a foot first. Usually when I teach this to my students, I show them how to make a slab for the foot. But I also want to show you how to make a coil foot, so I'm going to show you how to do both. Let's start with a coil foot because it doesn't take as many tools. Now when you're making a coil pot, the amount of clay you need is going to depend on how big of a pot you want. So I'm just going to cut some of this off. When I taught this to my high school students, I would start them off with about a pound of clay. So I would cut some of this off and then divide this into portions. You can always come back and get more clay as needed. But I found that if you get too much clay out at first, it'll dry out before you get a chance to use it. So we're just gonna start with like a fistful, just whatever you can hold in one hand or is about the size of a fist. And really, we don't even need this much to get started on our foot. So let's just take some of that and start to squeeze it into sort of that oblong coil shape. And then we'll move on to the work surface and start rolling it out. I hope that you're able to work on a canvas workboard because the clay doesn't stick to it. It allows the clay to move freely and you can spray it with water as needed. And if you're working on a super smooth surface, you may find your clay sticks or slides around. So having a canvas workboard is really nice. But let's talk about the basics of rolling a coil. So you want to roll all the way from the tips of your fingers to the very heel, the very edge of your hand here. Sometimes if my students are struggling to make good coils, they keep going flat or out of round, it's because they're not rolling with the full length of their hand. They're only rolling with like a small portion of their palm. If you're rolling a coil, but you only go like this, you're not fully rotating it. If I just go like this, the coil isn't fully turning over. It isn't going past 360 degrees. Whereas if I roll it all the way down and all the way up, then I'm rotating that coil multiple times, so I'm putting pressure all the way around instead of just turning it over. And that's gonna help it not go flat. If your coil goes flat, which happens to be a really easy fix for this, so it's gone kind of into an oval instead of into a circle, is to do a twist. I think of it as a candy twist because this is how a candy cane is twisted. It's also how like the wrapper on like a Jolly Rancher or something is twisted. And that will create these ridges that go all the way around and will allow you to roll the coil more smoothly and get into a better rhythm. The other thing you can do is simply set it up if it's going flat and tap it back down. That will kind of make it square, but square is better than an oval for getting back into round. And so here I'm doing that candy twist. If your clay is too dry, it's more likely to go flat or have problems when you're rolling it. So if you're really struggling with this, you may want to see if you can get some clay that has more water in it. Now my coil is already getting really long and I don't need it to be super long. So I'm going to go ahead and take part of this off and just set it aside. And you hear that sound? That's the coil not being round. It shouldn't make that sound if it's round. Now I am rolling all the way from the heel to the tip of my fingers, tips of my fingers all the way to the heel of my hand. When your coil is really short, you can just roll with one hand. But as your coil gets wider, you'll need two hands. And then you can also spread out your fingers as it gets even wider to really control that roll. It doesn't matter how long our coil gets, we can always tear it off and make it shorter to make it more manageable. The goal that we're aiming for is not the length of the coil, but how big around it is. So I just like to use my finger as a reference. I want the coil to be about as big around as a finger. Now when I taught this to high schoolers, a lot of the boys would be like, your fingers are a lot smaller than mine. And so I would tell them, well, if you feel like your fingers are a lot thicker than mine, just aim for the thickness of your pinky instead. But the thickness of the coil isn't that big of a deal. What we're trying to do is have a consistent measurement to where your coil is the same thickness every time. So if I tell you to make your coil the thickness of your finger, then when you make your next coil, you'll be getting it to about the same thickness as the first one. So let's start by making a foot out of this coil. It is a lot easier to start with a slab, but I did want to show you how to do this just in case that's something you're interested in. Now we're gonna roll this up into like a spiral. And the first thing I want to do is get the clay wet, because I want the clay to be able to bond to itself. It needs to have water on it. And that water on the coil is also going to help it be able to bend better without cracking. Now, two options here. I really like to use a serrated rib to score, but you can also just use a needle tool. My college professor also recommended using an old toothbrush. So it's just up to you what you want to use, but to keep it simple, if you only have a few tools, you can use your needle tool. We're going to score and just make a lot of marks all the way down the length of the coil. I like to do a diagonal. I don't think you should do a line that goes straight across. I think a diagonal is better, but really, where's the science in that? It's just a preference. And then I also like to do some cross hatching, where I go across it the other way. And you can see I'm just stabilizing the coil by holding it with my other hand. I go two directions just because it roughs up the clay more, and what we're trying to do here is create a rough texture in the clay to hold water. The other thing we can do is use our serrated rib. That's just gonna create a lot of scoring marks faster, and you can go two directions on this or not. I don't like to go straight down the length of the coil. I do think it creates a better texture. It roughs up the clay better if you go at a diagonal or straight across, but I would not go straight down the length. So let's take our sponge and we're just gonna get some water in it and just dab it down the length of the coil, and you should see a little bit of water build up in your scoring marks. Then I'm just gonna take the end here and pinch it into more of a point to help this next step go a little bit easier, and I'm gonna start to roll that coil in on itself. Typically you wanna score both sides of whatever you're bonding. So as I roll this, I'm gonna go ahead and score this. You could score both sides before you even start rolling, but there are multiple ways to do most of these steps. So just do whatever works for you. And my clay is soft enough that I don't need to keep adding water. There's enough water on this side that it should be fine. At this point, you could also use slip, although depending on how soft your clay is, you may not want to use slip. So this could be my foot, the entire size of it, or I could add another coil to make it a little bit bigger, which is what I'm gonna do. So typically when I teach this lesson, I tell my students that their foot needs to be as big around as the palm of their hand. Now, hands are not universally the same size, but that gives us a general size that will make it easy for you to work on your coils. If it is that big around, then you're gonna have an easier time reaching your hand inside of it to blend the coils together as we're working. So I'm gonna go a bit bigger just to make this easier to work on. Forgot to mention, towels are really handy for drying your hands and wiping them off when they get too messy. I'm gonna keep rolling this next coil, and I'm just twisting it because it already feels kind of flat. Again, starting off with one hand, and then once it gets long enough, I'm gonna add in the second hand. One thing that's really helpful is to start in the middle, and then as you're rolling it back and forth, go all the way out to the sides. That's gonna push the clay outwards. Another thing you can do is if your coils gets a thin spot like this, you can bring that back together by starting with your hands further out, rolling them closer and closer together. That can bring that thin spot back together. And now you can score this with your needle tool. I like using the serrated rib because it's a bit faster. And notice how I was able to get to about the thickness of my finger pretty quickly. And once you establish how thick you're making your coils, you just want to make them all about the same thickness. We're going to dab some water on this. Now my clay is pretty soft. If my clay was on the drier side, using slip here would be beneficial because I find that slip is helpful in bonding clay that is a little bit drier. One thing we want to do to bond the end of this coil to this coil better is we're going to cut the end here to a 45-degree angle. So 45 degrees, instead of being straight out, this is like 90 degrees. 45 degrees is here. So I'm just draw a line there and then cut all the way through. See how that makes it tapered? Then I'm going to cut this coil also at 45-degree angle. I want them to match up. So I'm going to cut it this way. And I'm just going to score the ends here. Whenever you attach clay to another piece of clay, you've got to score, you've got to add at least water, maybe slip. If you try to join clay without scoring and adding water or slip, that clay is not actually going to stick to each other. If you just press them up against each other, when the clay is wet, it may look like it's bonded, but as it dries, instead of that clay being bonded, it will slowly pull apart and create a crack there. When you score, that clay gets intertwined with each other, and adding water helps that process. And then instead of the clay pulling apart, it's stuck together, and as it dries, it won't pull apart. So that's why it's important to score and slip, or score and add water. Some people will try to just use slip, and that's just not gonna work. That's just gonna be a third piece of clay, a much wetter piece of clay in between those two parts, and it will just crack and fall apart as much as the clay. That scoring is really what's going to solidify that attachment. I'm going to keep scoring this as I roll it up. And when I'm rolling this up, I am putting some pressure on the coil to really press that clay together. I'm not distorting the shape of the coil. I don't want to press it to flatten the coil, but I also don't want to just like tap it together. I want to make sure that I'm putting a little bit of pressure. As you're putting that pressure, if you feel like the coil is collapsing, then you're pressing too hard, because we don't need to distort the shape. And then to end this neatly, I am going to go ahead and cut this at a 45-degree angle, just to make that tapered off nice. So that's one way to create your foot, and I'm going to leave it like this. I'm going to set it aside for a second. We will blend one side of these coils together. We're going to blend the inside together, but leave the outside as visible coils. But I need to let that slip that's just been made by the scoring and adding water dry a little bit to where it's not glossy wet. So I'm just going to set this aside for a minute, and I'm going to show you how to make a foot from a slab. So if you don't want to make a coil foot, we're gonna do a slab foot now. If you are making a coil foot, you don't need a slab foot. You can just set your foot aside, skip ahead, and start making some coils to add to the sides of your pot. So making a slab is a lot easier if you start off with a circle or a sphere. So I'm just gonna get my clay into a ball real quick. It doesn't have to be a good sphere. It's just kind of a roundish shape. So once I get to that point, I'm gonna start to flatten it into more of a pancake or like a tortilla. And then I can start by throwing it down on my table. And that's gonna push the clay out flatter. This is a quick way to make a slab. You don't need a rolling pin for this, but it will get a little bit more distorted and can kind of bounce out of control. All right, now typically you want the walls and the foot of your pot to all be about the same thickness, but we're gonna be doing some work on our coils that will make them a bit thinner. So it's okay for the foot to be a bit thinner than we're making our coils. So it's not gonna be the same thickness as my finger. I am gonna roll it a bit thinner with a rolling pin. You can do this just free-handed. Every time you roll it one direction, I like to pick it up, turn it over, but also rotate it 90 degrees. That way I'm stretching it out in multiple directions. So I did one roll there, pick it up, turn it over, rotate it 90 degrees. Now you don't have to do a full 90 degrees if it feels like it's getting longer one direction. Just turned it a little bit there, and that can also make it more round. Now this is starting to get thin. Another thing you can do if you're struggling to make your slabs uniform thickness, if they're really thick in one spot, thin in another, or if you're struggling to get them thin enough or if you're getting them too thin, use some rulers like this. This is about 1/8 of an inch thick. So if I put this on either side of my slab, then I can put even pressure all the way across. And this isn't even touching my slab because I've already rolled it that thin and evenly, but that can really help if you're new to rolling slabs or you're struggling with rolling slabs. There are more like fancy rulers or rolling pins that you can buy to get different thicknesses, but I find that this is enough. Okay, from here, we just need to cut out a circle to make our foot. And again, I wanna aim for the size of the palm of my hand. You can make a coil pot any size you want, but that is a good general measurement for starting your first coil pot. And your circle doesn't have to be perfect here, right? We're just gonna draw a general circle, but I will show you some tips for making this a better circle. My sponge is about the size of the palm of my hand, so I could put my sponge here and sort of outline my sponge. But to freehand it, you really want to start by drawing lightly on your clay, not cutting all the way through. And if it doesn't come out perfectly round, that's okay because you've only drawn on the surface, so you can erase parts that don't feel quite right and adjust them. Notice how I'm not putting my fist down to draw this. I'm drawing from my elbow, from my shoulder. So I'm drawing from all the way up here, and that's gonna help you draw a better circle. Also, don't do short little lines. You'll never get anywhere. Do long, confident lines. Once you've got a circle or a mostly circle shape, go ahead and start cutting all the way through your clay. It's really important not to point your needle tool straight down. If you point your needle tool straight down, you're gonna be carving, pressing it into the surface. And if you're working on a canvas board, it's gonna start cutting up your canvas. It won't cut through it immediately, but over time that can wear out your board. So it's really important when you're dragging your needle tool to lean it so that the needle is dragging behind you as you draw. So I keep it at like a 45-degree angle. And again, not pushing into the needle, pulling the needle so it's not gouging into your work surface. And notice how that angle is rotating as my line is rotating. Okay, now all we have to do here is just cut a line straight out from there and then lift this off, easy peasy. Then we're gonna wad this clay up. If your clay is super soft, very plastic, you don't need to add any water. If your clay is feeling a little bit dry, you can dunk it in your water and then wad it up to help prevent it drying out more. And so that is how to make a slab foot. Then I'm gonna gently pick this up. I can take my little sponge and go around the edges here and then just take my finger and kind of soften those corners a little bit so I don't have a lot of crumbs or rough edges. And I'll do that on the top and the bottom. Now here you can see where I drew on the back of that slab, and I'll blend that together when I start adding coils. I won't worry about it right now. Now, regardless of if you're using a slab foot or a coil foot, we're gonna set that aside. We wanna clear our space here. A lot of the time I see people try to keep like all their tools really close to them. You wanna move your tools out of the way so that you have plenty of room to roll out your coils. I find that if you have too much stuff in front of you or to the sides of you, you're gonna be more timid when you roll and you won't roll correctly. So like if my bowl is right here and I'm trying to roll this coil to adjust for that, I'm gonna move my hand weird, or I'm not gonna do full rolls because I don't wanna run my fingers into the bowl. So move your stuff out of the way so that you're not hampering yourself, so you're not preventing yourself from being successful. This clay is a little bit stiffer. It was a little bit drier at the top of my bag, so I'm gonna add some water to it to help it roll a little bit better. And you can hear that it's got a flat, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that candy twist thing. All right, just enough to where I can see the twist goes all the way around. And then that should help it get back into round. I learned about this trick from a video by Karen's Pots and Glass. Been really helpful for teaching my students how to do this and for my own practice. Okay, that sounds a lot better. I don't hear that bub, 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 bub. So I know that it's round and I can feel it, it's rolling easier. For this first coil, again, it doesn't matter how long it is, what matters is that it is the thickness of one of my fingers. And I wanna really keep that thickness of the coils consistent. So I'm gonna pick up my coil foot. I'm gonna show you how to add the first couple coils here. If you're not using the coil foot, I'll put in some chapters so you can skip ahead to where I'm working on the slab foot. To start, I wanna make sure that my coil is flexible. My clay is a little bit drier, so if it starts to crack as I'm bending it, I just wanna make sure that I put some water on it to help it bend without cracking. If your clay is already really plastic and flexible, you don't need to do that step. The other thing I'm gonna do is we're gonna stack this coil on the outer edge of the foot. We're not gonna put it out here on the side, we're gonna stack it on top. So I'm gonna go around and score the edge on the top, like an outline all the way around. And you can do this with the needle tool. I have the serrated rib. It's a lot easier, it's a lot faster, so I'm using it. Okay, then I'm gonna go down the entire length of my coil and do the same thing. Then I'm gonna take my sponge with a little bit of water in it and dab it all the way down. Notice how it's not soaking my board. I do have some water on my board, but it's not from doing this. It's not soaking my board. I'm not creating a big puddle. I'm just dabbing it enough to where I can see water built up in the coils like little puddles. And I'm gonna do the same thing on the foot. Now, I'm gonna take this coil, and I'm not gonna start on the end, I'm gonna start in the middle. So I'm gonna take the middle, and I wanna turn that score side to score side, and press it onto one side of the foot. I'm starting where that coil ends. Doesn't matter where you start, just start somewhere. And then I'm gonna slowly bring the coil around, pressing it so that they attach. I'm not deforming the coil, I'm not flattening it. I'm just pressing it so that it sticks. And when I get to here, right here, I'm gonna cut off the end of this coil, not 90 degrees, 45 degrees, right? Just halfway between horizontal and vertical. And you don't have to pick your foot up to do this. You could do this while it's sitting down, right? But see how that now is like a slope down into the foot? Okay, then I'm gonna wrap the rest of the coil around this way. And I wanna cut this coil at a matching angle so that they sit together, okay? Now I'm not gonna start right here because that'll make the coil too short. I'm gonna start that 45-degree angle up here. Okay, I'm gonna peel this back just enough that I can score it in here. Dab of water, then I'm gonna press it together. Okay, and see, we want the ends of these 45-degree angles to overlap on the top and bottom of the coils just a smidge. Okay, so that way it comes out to where it's like you made one coil all the way around. So we're gonna leave this coil visible on the bottom, but to really make sure that coil is strongly bonded, on the inside, we're gonna smooth it out. And this is where the wooden tool can come in really useful. While we're doing this, I'm gonna take my other bits of clay, wad them up together so that there's less surface area for the water to evaporate out of it, and I'm gonna put it back in my bag. Big part of making pottery is clay management, making sure that your clay doesn't dry out before you want it to. So that's why I'm putting it back in the bag, because I'm gonna be doing some work here that's gonna take a little while, and I don't want that clay drying out while I'm working here. So we're gonna blend these coils together, and we can do that just with like your thumb. I like to use like my nail, so I'll turn my thumb over and go like this. You could also use like a finger here. I find that's a little bit easier for me, and once it gets kind of moving around, then I can use just like the pad of my finger, right? But you can see I'm blending those coils together. Now, a key thing to blend those coils together is to drag across the division between the coils. So I'm not going the direction that the coils are going. I'm using my finger or my thumb to pull the clay into that crevice, into that space between the coils, and smooth it out. I'm not pressing super hard. You're not trying to move the whole thickness of the coil. We want the coils on the back or the outside to stay visible. We don't want to flatten them out too much. So I'm just changing the surface texture here. So it's not about putting a lot of pressure, it's about putting pressure in the right spots. So after I drag my finger across to smooth out those coils, then I might go in the direction that the coil was going to smooth it out, or go in just other directions to really smooth it out. And I don't want to leave any gouge marks or a new texture. I want my new texture to just be smooth. If you're having difficulty doing this with your fingers, another good way to do this is with a wooden tool. So I want to find something that kind of has this spoon shape, right? I want it to be bold on one side, like rounded over, and the other side doesn't really matter. I just want to have sort of that shape of the back of a spoon. And if you get a wider tool, like this one, that's like the width of your thumb, that's good for big spaces. And then you can get a smaller tool, like this one's a little bit skinnier, be more like the thickness of my pinky. That's good for getting into little narrow spaces. Now, coils can be used in a lot of ways. You can use coils to create a decorative texture, different patterns and stuff on your pot. You can use coils to build really big pots, and you can completely smooth the coils to make your pot almost look like it was wheel thrown. But today we're gonna focus on the simple basics. So we're just gonna keep all our coils stacking horizontally, and we're gonna smooth them on the inside to show you how to really bond them, and we're gonna leave that coil texture on the outside. Now, we do wanna bond this bottom coil to the foot, but I find that if you do that when you only have one coil here, you're more likely to push it out and change the overall form more than you want. So I'll go ahead and show you now, but then I'm actually gonna do that after I have a couple of coils added. So I'm gonna use this narrower tool, the skinnier one here, and I'm gonna start to press that coil at the top down into the foot. I don't wanna press the foot down flat. So I'm just pressing that clay down to bond it to the foot. Now you'll notice my texture here is really rough, right? So I'm just doing this first go around, but I'm gonna come back and smooth out that texture. The other thing you'll notice is I'm supporting the outside with my fingers. And that's because if I don't have my hand here, when I'm putting this pressure, I'm gonna push my coil off the edge of my pot, and I don't want it to move. So I'm gonna push that back in. And then I can go back around with my finger or with the tool, whatever works better for you, and smooth that out some more. Push, if I've like gouged into the foot of the clay, I can push some of that clay back so it's flat. I don't want to moat around the edge. I want the whole bottom to be one continuous plane. And that is the first coil, and then we'll add the second coil on top of this one. I am going to switch here though from doing the coil foot to doing my slab foot, and show you how to add a coil to the slab foot, and then the rest of it will be the same regardless of what type of foot you started with. And so you can just keep working on whichever foot you have. I'm not gonna finish this one. I prefer a slab foot. That's just my preference. You keep working on whatever kind of foot is your preference. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and get out my next bit of clay. And if you're doing this on the coil foot, you could skip ahead to the next chapter to continue on to the second coil. So I've got this clay. I'm gonna try to get that into a cohesive piece before I start rolling it out. And I am gonna start hitting it into more of that cylindrical long coil form, and just generally get it there. I'm rotating it in my hands, sort of rolling it between my hands to get that coil started. I don't need this entire length, I can already tell, so I'm just going to use half of that and start rolling with one hand. And then it starts to go flat, so I'll go ahead and twist it. Catching that flatness early is really important for making this easier. And I'll just go ahead and twist it again. Add my second hand. This part is a little bit thicker, so I'll just use one hand on that part for a second. Hear that thumping sound? It's going flat, so I'll twist it. Now, some people get upset because the end of the coil isn't pretty. I've heard this called like a snake's mouth, and you can pinch that shut if it's bothering you, but don't get too worried about it because most of the time we're gonna cut the end of the coil off anyway. All right, so start in the middle, move my way out. You'll see me move my hands around a lot because I usually just kind of move to where the clay looks and feels a little bit thicker. And I'll leave thin areas alone. I won't put pressure on them. And that just takes a little bit of practice, a little bit of experience. So that coil is about the thickness of my finger now, so I'm ready to go ahead and add it. Now you'll see here, it's cracking a little bit. That's not a problem. It's gonna get smoothed over. I can score it and make it part of the attachment, not a big deal. So my little slab here, I'm gonna go ahead and put the side that's prettier down, because now when I attach my coil, I'm gonna have score over this area anyway. So that makes that easy. Okay, so we're gonna start by scoring around the edges. We're gonna attach the coil on top of the foot. We don't wanna attach it around the outside. In my experience, attaching the coil to the outside of the foot just isn't as pretty, doesn't look as good. And that connection usually becomes like a failure point. Like this connection usually isn't as strong. And usually there's some gaps or something if you attach it that way, which is why we're gonna stack the coil on top of the foot. So you're gonna go around the edge of your foot here, and we just wanna score all the way through the top corner of that slab. I'm just doing this in my hand so I can hold it closer to the camera. There's no reason for you to hold it while you do this. And look, I've scored far into the slab just so I make sure it's wide enough for the coil, but you don't need to score the whole bottom. You can smooth it out if you did that. And I just wiped that extra clay off on the edge of my bowl here just to get rid of it. And then we're gonna score the entire length of our coil. Now, when we do this, it's just like when we made the coil foot, but if you skipped ahead and you didn't do that, here's how you do it. I recommend going at an angle. Don't go straight down. It doesn't rough up the clay enough. Going at an angle is gonna make more cuts and more grooves for that water to be held in. And I like to go 2 directions if my clay's a bit drier. If your clay is pretty wet, just 1 direction is good enough. I also like to go at an angle. I don't like going straight across this way. That's just preference. I'm gonna take my sponge, just put enough water in it to make it a little bit damp or a little bit wetter than damp. And then we're gonna go all the way down, just dabbing that coil so that you get a little bit of water built up in your score marks. Just little puddles all the way down. Notice how I'm not creating a puddle under my coil. I'm not getting water all over the board. I'm not soaking it. It's just on my coil, and then I'm gonna go around my foot. Now, you are gonna get water on your work board incidentally, that's fine. We just don't wanna work in a puddle. You don't wanna soak your board and make your work area overly wet. I'm going through all these steps again, just in case you didn't watch the first part. So if you're bored, because you already did it, skip ahead. We're not gonna start at either end. We're gonna start in the middle of the coil, and I'm gonna turn this score side down to face the score side on the foot. And I'm just gonna give it a little pressure, press it just a little bit. I don't wanna deform and flatten the coil too much. It is gonna move a little bit, but we don't wanna make it too big of a deal, okay? And I'm just gonna wrap this coil around. Remember, we're stacking the coil on top of the foot and just gently pressing it down. Now I'm gonna keep going around. Now I made this coil really long. Could have stopped here and just started adding the other side of the coil. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do that. So the next step here is we need to cut off our coil and join it together. You could just continue this. You could score here and continue this on top. I've done that before. I don't like it as much as stacking each individual coil. It's easier for me to manage my coils that way. So we're gonna do this instead. I'm gonna pick this up and show you here. You don't need to pick yours up because you can kind of like duck down and look at the side. But we wanna cut a 45-degree angle here. So 90 degrees is straight down towards the foot. 45 degrees is at an angle halfway between the horizontal of the foot and the vertical 90 degrees. So we wanna cut a 45-degree angle right here. And then we also want to cut a 45-degree angle on this coil, but we don't want to do it right here. See that little air gap? We don't want to start it right here. We want to start it a little bit higher on the angle of this other coil. That way they overlap a little bit and we don't have any holes or gaps between our coils. So that's going to overlap like this. And what we're going to do before we put those together is we are going to score them. Now, if your clay is super wet, you may not need to add water here if there's already a lot of water from joining it to the foot, but it's very likely that you will need to at least dab a little bit of water in here, or slip if you're using that. Okay, that looks good. So I've brought those beveled edges, those 45-degree angles together. See, they stack together nicely, and now it's like we just have one continuous coil. I'll blend those together just like we learned how to do on the pinch pots, and I'll do that on the inside and the outside. We are gonna blend this coil into the foot a little bit more. We're gonna join them more completely, but I find that that's a lot harder to do when you just have one coil. It's really easy to gouge through your foot. So we're gonna go ahead and add our second coil before we continue bonding. The other reason that I do that is that's gonna give the water that we just added to the clay time to absorb into the clay and evaporate out and be a little bit drier. And that's gonna allow those two pieces of clay to bond to each other before we start blending. If I start trying to blend now, that water may be too slippery and the clay may move around too much. Whereas if I let some of that water dry out and absorb into the clay, that bond is gonna be stronger and it's gonna be easier to work with. So let's go ahead and roll another coil. Whether you started with the coil foot or the slab foot, the rest of these steps are gonna be the same. So I'm not gonna be going back and forth and completing both pots. I'm just gonna finish the slab footed pot. Now, one thing I can do with these coils that I'm holding on to is I can take my sponge and dab them with water so that they don't dry out as I'm working on other parts of the clay. If they're really close to being dry, I can also just dip them in my water, but you want to be careful about doing that too often. We don't want the clay to be too soft because then it'll squish too much and it might collapse in on itself as you're building. Now it's important when you're rolling out your coil that again, you move all those tools out of your way so that you have all the room you need to roll out your coils. And look, I'm rolling all the way from the heel of my hand to the tips of my fingers. And then whenever I start to feel it go out around, I want to make sure that I do that twist or that I tap it back into square so that it gets round again. And again, start in the middle and work your way out is best practice, but you can also monitor and adjust. Like notice if it's thicker in one place, work on that spot. If it gets too thin, start with your hands outside that thin spot and work them towards each other. That's gonna bring the clay in, gathering it up to make a thicker or even out that part of the clay. Let's go ahead and do this one. I'm gonna bring my pot back into my workspace. I'm going to score my coil and I'm gonna show you again how to use the needle tool to do that, just in case you missed it before. All you're gonna do is diagonally create all these little marks all the way down the length of the coil, and you can also crisscross it or cross hatch it. Really what we wanna do is find a movement that is efficient, that is quick and effective. That way you're not spending too much time doing this. A lot of people give up on coil pots because there's so much scoring. And so if you can get yourself a serrated rib, that makes a really good alternative to using the needle tool. Again, a toothbrush works really well for this. I find that using slip when you use the toothbrush method is a little bit better. Also using slip is better if your clay is a little bit drier. If your clay is still pretty flexible, it's better to use water. And there are specialty scoring tools that kind of look like a needle tool that has like multiple wires fanned out on the end. So if you have one of those, you could use that. I don't have one of those. So this is all scored. Now, whenever we make an attachment, you score both sides. So I need to score this side. Now I need to score what I'm attaching it to. And again, the direction doesn't matter. You just want to make it messy. This is a little bit harder for my students who are perfectionists, but right now, perfection is being messy. Okay, I'm just wiping that off on the edge of my bowl or your bucket, so that way that clay doesn't dry on here and get crusty. Take our sponge, a little bit of water in it, dab it all the way down the length here, and then go around your foot or your pot here. And you'll notice I squeeze out that water back into the bowl because I don't want to soak my board when I set the sponge down. So I'm gonna pick this up, again, turn it over so that score mark goes to score mark, and I'm setting it down, but then I'm also going around and gently pressing it down. You could press down with like a thumb like this. You could also do like a pinch press where you have your thumb on the inside and your finger on the outside if you find that helps you keep the shape of the coil better. This time, I'm gonna reserve more length of my coil, so I'm gonna bring this around here more. Now I need to cut that 45-degree angle, so if I'm cutting it and I'm not picking it up, I wanna think about it being a little bit sideways here. So it's a slope down into the coil below it. Now I'm gonna cut the other one. Remember, we want those slopes to be matching so that they can overlap. And this really is easier if you pick it up and look at it, or if you kind of get down on the level to look at it. Remember to score that. If you don't score it here, those coils, as that clay shrinks and dries, will pull apart. That's looking pretty good. Now that I have 2 layers, I can start bonding the foot to the bottom. The foot and the bottom coil are gonna end up looking like one piece. You can take your serrated rib here and score across that connection and smooth it out. And this is the only time we're gonna smooth one coil into another or the coil into the foot. The rest of the coils will be distinct from each other. Now, I wanna push the foot, like that little corner, up into the coil above it. I can also push that coil down into the foot if that fills it in better. So I'm making it more of a continuous piece of clay.
And that is going to strengthen that bond between the foot and the bottom coil, but it is more of an aesthetic choice. It looks better when you have a slab foot to blend it into that bottom coil because of the different thicknesses of the clay. But if you made a coil foot, you can skip this step because we're also going to blend the clay together on the inside of the pot.
Now again, be careful, we're only doing this on the bottom coil, we're not doing it on the second coil. And I do find that this is easier to do if I pick up the pot than trying to do it while it's sitting on the table, but you do whatever works best for you. You just wanna make sure that if you're pushing it down onto your work surface, that you're not creating a weird angle here. So make sure you pick it up and look at it and make sure that foot looks good. Okay, so that's blended together really nicely on the outside. In addition to going up and down to blend it together, I also then want to go kind of around to create a nice smooth texture. Really blend it and take your time here to get that texture nice. Okay, so that looks really good. You can't tell the difference between my bottom coil and my foot. Now on the inside, we can still see the differences. So we're gonna work on that here. You can do this with your finger. I can get my thumb in here or my finger or whatever's comfortable. I'm trying to do it to where you can see it on camera, so it's a little harder to do. You could do this where you're blind, where you can't see what you're doing, but you can feel it. I'm gonna take my thumb or my finger and push this clay from the bottom coil down into the foot. I do recommend doing this on the surface so that you don't accidentally punch through your foot or distort it, but I'm just trying to hold this at an angle where you can see it better first. Okay, now it's not blended together yet, but we are gonna work in that direction. Now, you can do this with your finger, but it is easier with a tool. So again, we wanna look for a tool that has sort of that spoon back shape. It's kind of shaped like the pad of a finger. I'm gonna use this skinnier one since I'm trying to work in this tight space. And you wanna take it like you would take your finger and push down on that clay to push it down into the foot. But again, we don't want to gouge the foot. We want to press that clay and then smooth it into the foot surface. You don't want to push it down so hard that you dig into the foot too much. If you do, that's okay. We can recover from that. You can smooth it out then by moving the tool back and forth or blend it with a finger, whatever works for you. Now you're going to find here that fingernails, thumbnails, they might get in the way and gouge your clay, so using a tool might be a little bit easier. Okay, so see how I'm just doing a little bit, rotating, doing a little bit, and that's just to keep it at an angle that's comfortable so I'm not twisting my hand and so that I can see what I'm doing. And I've come all the way back around. Now you can see sort of that texture from the tool, and you would see that with your finger as well. So now I just want to go around, kind of like we did with the pinch pot, and do kind of that swipe pinch. I'm not really pinching, I'm just like swiping that clay around, and then that shows me, oh, I didn't fully bond it here, so I can set it down and work on it a little bit more right there. Pick it back up, really look at that texture and get it pretty. And notice I'm supporting the outside. Anytime you put pressure on the inside of the pot, you need to make sure you're supporting the outside. And the same goes for the foot. I've got my hand under the foot, but also if I'm putting some more pressure on that foot, I might put these fingers underneath so I have better control over that pinching motion and so that I don't accidentally deform my pot. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. I want to make sure that the inside bottom here is nice and smooth. Now you could intentionally texture this, but I think the first time you make a coil pot is a good practice to practice smoothing, because even if you want texture, it's a good idea to smooth first and then add your texture intentionally instead of having like a texture that you mean to have on top of a messy, sloppy texture. The next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna blend the top coil into the bottom coil. We're not gonna do that on the outside. We're only doing this on the inside, and that's to make sure that those coils are really bonded to each other and that they don't break as it shrinks or even as it fires. I had a coil pot that I made in high school that I did not know how to do this, and after years, it popped apart and I super glued it back together. It's fine, but smoothing the coils together on the inside allows you to use those coils as decoration on the outside, but also have a better bond between those coils. I'm gonna take my thumb here and just press that clay down. It's almost like I'm taking the inside edge here of the clay and just pressing it down. And when I do that, that does put some pressure outward on this coil. So if I don't support it, it won't really grab the clay and bring it down, and it'll push that coil out. But if I support it with my finger like this, I can really swipe some of that clay down into that crack, into that joint. Now I like to do this once like every 3 to 4 coils. We're doing it here with the first 2 coils, but after this, I'll put 3 or 4 coils on before I do this. The really thing you wanna make sure you do is that any coils you attach get bonded to each other in the same work session. So before I take my lunch break, I'm gonna finish bonding this coil to this coil. If I was gonna pack this up for the day, I would make sure all the coils I attached today got bonded to each other in this way. Okay, so now I'm gonna go around and just make that texture prettier, smooth it out more. So now the inside looks like one smooth, continuous piece of clay where we don't see the coils separation anymore. And again, I'm supporting the outside so they don't accidentally change the shape of the coils on the outside. I'm having a hard time getting in here with my finger, so I'm gonna use my tool. Use whatever works best for you. Okay, right here is where I joined the 2 ends of the coil, so I'm gonna go ahead and blend that over. The bottom of this is looking a little bit funny, so I'm gonna smooth that again. And again, I wanna just make sure that if I accidentally gouge my clay, I go ahead and smooth it. Now, coil pots can be worked on for multiple days. I've had a coil pot that I worked on for a month. The key is to make sure that everything that you work on in one day gets smooth, gets connected really well, because as you're working, the bottom of your pot can be drier than the top of your pot. It just needs to be a gradual change from drier leather hard to soft plastic clay. You don't want to let part of your pot get to bone dry, but it's okay if the bottom, and sometimes necessary for the bottom part to be leather hard while you're still working on the plastic, softer clay at the top. One last thing before I take a little break here, I'm gonna go ahead and go around and smooth out this texture. So all these marks from where I scored the coil are showing, and they're not nice. They don't feel good after it's fired, and they don't look good right now. So I don't wanna see any of what I call overscoring. I don't want to accidentally smooth out the coils to where you don't see them anymore. I would just wanna make sure that the coils are distinct from each other but pretty. So I'm gonna take a tool like this and just go around, and I've got the edge of it in that space between the coils so that they stay distinct from each other, and just smooth that out. And I can do that with a finger if that works better. If your fingers get too much clay built up on them, it's a good idea to go ahead and like clean that clay buildup off so that you don't get bits of dry clay sticking to your fresher clay. As you get better at this, you'll do your score marks better so that you don't have as much cleanup. You may have a lot of cleanup on this first pot because you're learning. The other thing that can happen sometimes on your first coil pots is that your coils, like you lose them completely and maybe you feel like you need to redraw them in. This is fine, especially for your first pot when you're learning. I don't like the way that that looks now that I can do better. So I try to keep that natural edge of the coil visible. Also though, a lot of the time that gets covered up in the glaze, so it's not that big of a deal. And really, I'm talking here about aesthetic preferences, just what I prefer. We can have different opinions and that's okay. Notice how using this tool creates sort of these ridges. So I'll smooth back over those to really make it round. I want it to feel like it's a coil. Now, these are the tools that I had in my classroom, but if you're working on your own, and maybe you've bought your own tools, you might have some of these sort of silicone brushes. It's really flexible. This might be an easier tool to use for this. And you can get some like softer textures with it. So a tool like this can be helpful, but again, you saw me do most of this without a tool like this. And you see that sort of like wavy texture on the inside? I can keep working on that. As the clay gets stiffer, it will be harder to get like deep waves, but I can get more surface texture easily. Before I take a little break here to recharge my camera batteries, let's talk about like if you're taking a break, putting your stuff away for today. Make sure you clean your tools. Clay left on your tools can cause them to rust or to grow mold. So make sure you're cleaning up your tools regardless of if you're leaving for an hour or 24 hours. Stuff happens. Sometimes you intend to come back in a couple hours, and it's a couple days before you can get back. So take good care of your tools and clean up like you're leaving for a while, no matter if you think you are or not. In my experience, you can't save coils from one day to the next. I can put these coils away in my bag and come back and use them in about an hour. But if I'm gone for a day, these coils will be too stiff to work with and they won't bond well to the rest of the clay. So what I'm gonna do, because I think I'll be back, is I'm going to dip them in water and just set them on top of the rest of the clay in my bag. If I'm not back in time to use them, if they dry out before I get to use them, I can recycle that clay and use it again. If you know you're done for the day, go ahead and just wad those coils back up into one homogeneous piece of clay. That way the clay doesn't dry out and you can keep using it next time you come to work on your pot. Now for my pot, I am gonna put it in a bag. In my classroom, we used Ziploc bags because that was easier for my students. I'm just gonna use this bag that used to have clay in it. Now when we do this, you just wanna lift this carefully. It's not too much to handle right now, but I like to hold it on my hand, slide it into the back of the bag, set it down gently. And one thing that's really key here is get the extra air out of the bag. That's gonna help you more than sealing the bag. So if I can get as much air out of here as possible, that's gonna stop the water from having a place to evaporate into and slow down the drying process. Okay, and then I'm just gonna clean up my tools and take a little break and recharge all my batteries. It's also important when you're cleaning your wooden tools not to soak them. So I don't put them in the water. I get my sponge wet and I wipe the clay off of them. Putting them under running water may feel helpful or like it's faster, but having your tools soaked like that can encourage them to grow mold. And then I'll just leave them kind of spread out if you have that luxury. Spread out to where they can dry, or put them on a towel and dry them off a little bit before putting them away. If your tools are wet, try not to put the wet side down in a cup. So if you have a tool cup that you generally put your tools in, I don't recommend putting them back in there while they're wet. That will help prevent mold growth. So if you have a tool cup, maybe like one of those pen cups or something that's mesh, that can also help allow air to circulate so that your tools don't grow mold when they're wet. That's it for those tips. All right, I'll see you back here in a little bit.